The combat phase is arguably one of the most important phases in Magic. It's during this phase that you are going to win the majority of your games. But I recently found out there's an alarming amount of players that don't actually know the steps and rules of this phase. So when Wizards of the Coast approached me to sponsor a video, I knew I had to cover this topic. In this video, I'm going to cover the entire combat phase, exactly what you need to do in each step, and when you can cast spells and activate abilities, as well as cover some cards, mechanics, and interactions that often trip up newer players during this phase. I'm going to chapter each section too, so you can refer back to a certain point if you need to. Before I start, however, there are two small prerequisites. You must have a basic understanding of priority, as this is what we will use to progress through the different steps and phases of the game, and you should know about AppNap, active player, non-active player. For more information on AppNap, you can watch this video here. Otherwise, the basics are, in a two-player game, whoever's turn it is the active player, and the other player is the non-active player. Okay, with that out of the way, let's jump into it. The combat phase is the third phase in a typical turn and generally has 5 steps in the following order: beginning of combat step, declare attacker's step, declare blocker's step, the combat damage step, and the end of combat step. So let's start at the beginning of combat step. This step occurs immediately after the pre-combat main phase when both players pass priority while the stack is clear. This commences the start of the combat phase of the turn.
Get ready for the next battle.
There are 2 things that have to happen here. Firstly, if you're playing a multiplayer variant of the game like Emperor, the active player chooses one of their opponents and they become the defending player. This is a special turn-based action and doesn't use the stack. I personally have never played Emperor and I've never had to action Rule 507.1 in the last 15 years I've played the game, so I wouldn't worry too much about this part. After this, the active player gains priority. It's also worth noting that there are a number of permanents that have, at the beginning of combat or at the beginning of each combat, triggered abilities. It's at this point you would put those triggers on the stack and choose relevant targets for them. If multiple players have abilities that trigger at the beginning of combat, they are placed on the stack in AppNap order, meaning the non-active player's triggers will resolve first. It's also at this point that players make their first mistake with the combat phase. In this example, we have a Battle Rattle Shaman in play, which says, at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may have target creature get +2/+0 until the end of turn. And we also have Dread Statuary, a land that you can activate and turn into a creature until the end of turn. Our objective here is to attack our opponent with the creature land and have it be buffed by the Shaman. The mistake that players often make is simply waiting until the combat step to activate their creature land. As I previously mentioned, as soon as we move from the first main phase to the combat phase, the beginning of combat step happens and any at the beginning of combat triggers are placed on the stack and the targets are chosen. If the land isn't a creature at this point, you cannot target it with the Shaman's ability. What you need to do is activate your land during your main phase. Just be wary though, thanks to how priority works, after the creature land's ability has resolved, there's another round of priority and your opponent might take this opportunity to destroy your creature land with a removal spell. This example also applies to things like vehicles and any other non-creature permanents that can become creatures. So while the beginning of combat step might look like a whole lot doesn't happen here on paper, there can be some significant decisions you need to make just before entering this step. So to sum this all up, when we move to the beginning of combat step, those permanents with at the beginning of combat trigger and then the active player gets priority. Once a round of priority has been passed and the stack is clear, we then move to the declare attacker's step. So, on to the declare attacker's step, and believe it or not, the very first thing that happens in the declare attacker's step is that the active player declares attackers. Another trip up some players stumble into here is that when you're in the declare attacker's step, you do not get a chance to crew vehicles or animate lands so you can attack with them. The last chance you had to do that was during the beginning of combat step. Again, the very first thing you do during the declare attacker step is the active player declares their attackers. There are actually 12 steps you need to take to declare an attacker, and I'm not going to cover all of them in great detail, but it is important to be aware of them. Firstly, the active player chooses if any creatures they control will attack. Those creatures must be untapped, and one of my favourite points, they cannot be a battle. Each of those creatures chosen must have haste or have been controlled by the active player since the turn began. The active player then announces which player, planeswalker, or battle each of the chosen creatures is attacking. After this, steps 508.1c through to 508.1j are checking things like, do the creatures you've chosen have any restrictions for attacking? If any of them have banding, you don't actually tap your creatures until step F. Steps G through J check for things like paying costs for attacking, for example, paying Ghostly Prison's costs. And finally, at step 108.1k, your chosen creatures are now officially attacking, and on step 108.1m, any abilities that trigger on attackers being declared triggers. After you put these abilities on the stack, the active player then gets priority. And from here, we basically continue like normal. Now, section 508 of the rules does go on to explain in more detail some important information about attacking and triggered abilities, but I'm not going to cover that. Instead, I highly recommend you check out KeepingItCasual's video. They make excellent bite-sized rules content.
What do you mean it never attacked?
It never attacked.
Alright, when Ilharg attacked, you had to pay 2 to the Ghostly Prison, right?
Yep.
And Ilharg put Blade Historian onto the battlefield tapped and attacking.
Yep.
And Blade Historian gives them both double strike because they're both attacking.
Sounds about right to me.
Therefore, they're both attacking and should pay the 2.
The Historian never attacked.
How does that make any sense?
Links in the description down below. So, once attacks are declared and both players pass priority while the stack is clear, we then move on to the declare blockers step. The rules for the declare blockers step are nearly identical to the declare attackers step. If you want to block with any vehicles or manlands, you need to make sure they're creatures before you go into this step. The last chance you have to do that is after attacks have been declared and the active player passes priority to you. As with the declare attackers step, the first thing we do in the declare blockers step is to declare blocks. The defending player chooses which creatures they control, if any, will block. The chosen creatures must be untapped, and they also can't be battles. For each of the chosen creatures, the defending player chooses one creature for it to block that's attacking that player, a planeswalker they control, or a battle they protect. Again, we go through practically the same steps. We check to see if any of the blockers have any blocking restrictions, or if the attacking creatures have any evasion. We pay any cost for blocking, and so on. The most important rule to remember here is 509.1h. Once an attacker has a blocker declared for it, it becomes blocked, even if all creatures blocking it are removed from combat. After blocks are declared, and triggers for blocking get placed on the stack, the active player gains priority. Again, Rule 509 then goes on to explain some definitions for blocking triggered abilities. Now, before we jump into the combat damage step, don't forget, if you're looking to expand your Magic collection, or perhaps you want to get a friend into Magic, you should definitely check out the Foundation's Beginner Box or the Foundation's Starter Collection. Think of the Beginner Box as a real-life MTG arena tutorial. It also comes with 10 themed Jumpstart decks and will even walk you through your first game. The Starter Collection comes with over 350 cards and a bunch of basic lands so you can start building decks right out of the box. It even has enough cards to kickstart your first couple of Commander decks. Personally, I'm tempted to pick this up and build a cube with it. For more information, be sure to check the links in the description. Thanks again to Wizards of the Coast for sponsoring this video. So here we are, the combat damage step. Now this step is actually quite simple, but what makes it complicated is keyword abilities like Death Touch, Trample, and First Strike. I'm going to cover all of those interactions in the next video, so stay tuned. But first, let's make sure we understand what we need to do during this step. So at the beginning of the combat damage step, the active player announces how each attacking creature is going to assign its damage, and then the non-active player, the defender, announces how each blocking creature will assign their damage. Both players assign a creature's damage according to the following rules. Each attacking and blocking creature assigns combat damage equal to its power. Any creature with 0 or less power don't assign combat damage at all. An unblocked creature assigns its damage to the player, planeswalker, or battle it's attacking. A blocked creature assigns its damage to the creature blocking it. If no creatures are blocking it because it was destroyed or removed at the end of the declare blocker's step, it assigns no combat damage. If 2 or more creatures are blocking it, here's the new Foundation rule. It assigns its combat damage to those creatures divided as its controller chooses among them. Here's an example. An attacking Elvish Regrower is blocked by a Vampire Spawn and a Helpful Hunter. Elvish Regrower's controller can assign all 4 damage to the Hunter, or 1 damage to the Spawn and 3 damage to the Hunter, or 2 damage to each creature, or 3 damage to the Spawn and 1 damage to the Hunter, or all 4 damage to the Spawn. After the attacker assigns their combat damage, the same thing happens for any blocking creatures. They assign their damage to the attackers in the same way. And then, with Rule 501.1e, the game checks both players assigned their damage correctly, and if you didn't, the game returns to the moment before that player began to assign damage. Once everything has been assigned correctly, combat damage is finally dealt. This happens simultaneously and is a turn-based action. It doesn't use the stack and it cannot be responded to. Once this happens, any abilities that trigger on damage being dealt get put on the stack, and then the active player gets priority. Now of course, neither I nor the rulebook have forgotten Rule 501.4 states that if one attacking or blocking creature has First Strike or Double Strike, as the combat damage step begins, only those creatures assign combat damage. After that, instead of moving to the end of combat, there's a second combat damage step where the rest of the creatures and those with Double Strike will now deal their damage. It's worth noting that after the First Strike combat damage step, there's a round of priority and players may cast instant speed spells at this point. Here's a fun corner case. After a First Strike creature has dealt damage, if it wasn't blocked, you can ninjutsu in a creature and then that creature will get to deal damage during the normal combat damage step. Have fun with that one. After all the damage has been dealt and priority has been passed, we move to the final step of the combat phase, the end of combat step. Compared to the other steps, not a lot happens here, but there's one super important thing that you need to be aware of, and we'll get into that in a second. Once the end of combat step starts, the active player gets priority. Abilities that trigger at the end of combat trigger, and effects that last until end of combat expire at the end of the combat phase, basically as this step ends. Now, here's the important part. Rule 511.3, as soon as the end of combat step ends, all creatures, battles, and planeswalkers are removed from combat. After the end of combat step ends, the combat phase is over and the post-combat main phase begins. This means that during this step, even though damage has been dealt, creatures are still attacking and still blocking. Let's look at this example. Let's say you have a 1/1 in play and an Iganjo Seat of the Empire in hand, which says channel, pay 3, discard Iganjo, it deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Your opponent has a 4/5 Sheoldred in play and a number of cards in hand. You attack with the 1/1 and your opponent decides to block with this Sheoldred. After blocks are declared, most new players will look to channel their Iganjo right away and deal 4 damage to the Sheoldred. The only problem with that is that your opponent could simply respond with a removal spell of their own and destroy the 1/1, and Sheoldred will survive with 1 health. The trick here is to remember that creatures are still in combat even after combat damage has been dealt. So in this case, the optimal play is to let the Sheoldred block the 1/1, move to combat damage, Sheoldred destroys the 1/1, and the 1/1 deals 1 damage back. Now you can destroy the Sheoldred with the Aganjo. Even though the combat damage has been dealt, all creatures are still attacking or blocking right up until the combat phase ends. Now, once both players pass priority during the end of combat step, we now leave the combat phase and begin the post-combat main phase. So there's everything you need to know about the entire combat phase. Stay tuned for my next video about things like trample, death touch, and double strike interactions during this phase. Did you have any questions about anything I covered? As always, be sure to like the video if you learned something, and subscribe, because if you don't, I'll make wizards put damage back on the stack. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.